Welcome back, focused learners. We're jumping right into another explainer today, and we're going to be cracking open the literal source code of society itself. Think about your everyday life for a second. The roads you drive on, the schools, the laws, your taxes, all of it. The invisible operating system running that whole shebang is public administration. But here's the thing. What keeps that massive system from just crashing? What actually keeps it working for us instead of against us? Well, it all comes down to a vital framework we call public administration ethics.
Okay, let's dive into this. What happens when the people who make the rules, well, break the rules? Or even worse, what if the rules themselves are just fundamentally flawed from the get-go? It's a highly provocative question, for sure, but it's one that affects every single one of us. Because when a government's operating system gets corrupted, society, you and I, we're the ones who end up paying the ultimate price.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, defining public administration ethics. Then, the rules and their glitches. Number 3, core obligations of public servants. 4, why public ethics matter. 5, factors shaping administrative ethics. And finally, number 6, the cost of ethical failure.
Starting off with Section 1, defining public administration ethics, the blueprint of governance. And this brilliantly illustrates the incredibly delicate balance we have to strike in administration. You see, on one side of the scale, we've got private ethics. These are driven by personal morals, emotions, your internal compass. But on the other side, we have public ethics, which are strictly driven by social norms, formal codes, and hard laws. Now, when these two sides align, it's beautiful. You get total harmony, we're talking peace, social progress, well-being. But what happens when a public servant's private desires completely conflict with their public duties? Well, it leads straight to civil unrest, massive confusion, and eventually a direct challenge to the very legitimacy of the government itself.
Moving right along to Section 2, the rules and their glitches, bugs in the bureaucratic code.
Traditionally, public servants are basically handed down these generally worded commandments. You know the ones. Act in the public interest. Be politically neutral. Do not disclose confidential information. Provide efficient, effective, and fair service. Avoid conflicts of interest. And of course, be accountable. Sounds pretty perfect on paper, right? But here is the reality check. These top-down rules often totally lack clarity, and honestly, they can be practically impossible to actually implement. Just take political neutrality, for example. Yes, it's a core principle, but civil servants and politicians literally have to work hand in hand every single day. So maintaining pure, absolute neutrality, it's kind of an illusion.
So the crucial point is that these rules often end up directly clashing with one another. Think about it. You've got a target-oriented approach, which is all about efficiency, speed, and effectiveness in hitting those goals. But then you've got a means-oriented approach, which demands strict adherence to the rules, total objectivity, and rigid accountability. A public servant's intense drive to be super fast and efficient might actually force them to compromise on their legally mandated objectivity or their empathy. It's literally a bug in the bureaucratic code, where doing one part of your job perfectly means you're almost guaranteed to fail at another.
Section 3, core obligations of public servants, the pillars of service.
So, to keep those system glitches from completely crashing the network, public servants are expected to internalize 9 essential obligations: selflessness, integrity, honesty, compassion, dedication, probity, which basically means absolute, strict moral decency, efficiency, effectiveness, and economy. We are not just looking at a nice little wish list here. These 9 pillars essentially act as the antivirus software for the entire system. Good governance absolutely demands that these values aren't just, written down on some dusty piece of paper. They have to be actively practiced to shape behavior at every single level.
Which brings us to Section 4, why public ethics matter, the underlying programming.
Now, what's really interesting here is how these incredibly deep, heavy philosophical concepts map directly onto what you and I expect from our leaders today. Think about it. Rousseau argued for maintaining the general will of the people. Hobbes and Locke laid out the obligations of the social contract. Immanuel Kant emphasized a strict moral duty that leads to universal action. Bentham and J.S. Mill pushed for the greatest good for the greatest numbers. And John Rawls, he was all about ensuring absolute justice in society. When we demand things like transparency, fairness, and justice today, we are quite literally demanding that our leaders execute the ethical programming written by these exact philosophers centuries ago.
But hey, it isn't just ancient philosophy we're talking about. This is backed by hard law. In constitutional democracies, these ethics are strict legal imperatives.
For instance, if we look at the Indian Constitution, Article 14 establishes a hard legal obligation for civil servants to be completely impartial. Article 15 provides a clear directive for objectivity, and the constitutional value of secularism, that serves as the very root of tolerance in the administration. These formal codes of conduct take all that high-minded philosophy and translate it into strict, actionable legal mandates.
Let's move to Section 5, Factors Shaping Administrative Ethics. Environmental hazards. So, I want you to ask yourself a question. What actually shapes these ethical standards in the real world? Like, why do some systems just hum along smoothly, while others are completely riddled with corruption? Well, let's step away from textbook theory for a second and look at stark reality. First up, we've got historical factors, because the past absolutely dictates the present. For example, corruption in the Indian system has deep, complex roots extending all the way back to colonial rule. The legacy of how an administration was originally constructed continues to shape its daily operation. But then contrast that with Japanese society, which has a very deeply ingrained historical track record of high ethical standards in public life. The historical starting point matters. Let's see how this builds into legal factors, because how a law is actually applied drastically shapes human behavior. Impartial implementation actively promotes ethics. We saw this with the UK's handling of the Prime Minister's party case. It clearly showed that nobody is insulated from the rules. But conversely, ethics completely fail when individuals act above the law, like the well-known incident in India where a politician's relative attacked a municipal officer with a cricket bat. It's simple, right? When the law doesn't apply equally to everyone, the entire ethical framework just collapses. Then, we have to look at socio-cultural factors. Because administrators don't just drop out of the sky, they emerge from society itself. And sometimes, constitutional values get imposed onto a society that might inherently clash with them. This friction reflects real-world discrimination right inside the administration. We see this in caste-based issues like the Rohit Vemula case, or gender-based accusations such as the case involving a former Andaman chief secretary. We also see religious discrimination, like when Delhi police forced Muslim men to sing the national anthem. These are stark, factual instances showing exactly how deeply ingrained societal biases can essentially override the imposed constitutional code. Finally, there are economic factors. Think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs for a second. You have to fulfill basic survival needs before you can ever worry about psychological ones. In a very real sense, ethics is a need of the mind, not the belly. Violence and riots tightly correlate with poverty and resourcelessness. If you look at historical comparisons of unrest in poverty-stricken areas in Kerala versus Uttar Pradesh, it perfectly illustrates this point. Economic desperation directly undermines public ethics. Simply put, you just can't code ethics into a starving system. And that brings us to our final section, Section 6, the cost of ethical failure, the system crash. The impacts of a complete lack of ethics are, well, they're catastrophic. It triggers a massive systemic cascade. First, you get a total loss of government legitimacy. From there, it's a rapid erosion of public trust and credibility. Social capital gets completely diluted. The entire developmental process slows down to a crawl. And ultimately, it leads to the total impossibility of good governance. Without ethics, the fundamental machinery of the state simply grinds to a halt. It's literally the ultimate blue screen of death for a society. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a profound final thought to really chew on. If ethics truly are a need of the mind rather than the belly, can we ever actually expect perfect ethical governance in a vastly unequal world? Like, can the operating system ever be truly bug-free as long as deep poverty and ingrained societal biases still exist? I want you to think about that the very next time you interact with your local administration or even just read the news. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.